My name is Emma. I'm 27, and I've spent my entire life being the gullible little sister who couldn't let go of childish beliefs. At least, that's what my sister Claire always said, until the night she drowned and came back with a story she couldn't explain. Growing up in the same house, sleeping in adjacent rooms, sharing the same parents, none of that mattered. Claire and I existed in completely different worlds. Her world was built on equations, evidence, and rational explanations. Mine had room for faith, for the invisible threads connecting all things, for God. The divide between us grew with every year, every debate, every eye roll from across the dinner table. "When will you grow up, Emma?" she'd ask, her voice dripping with the academic authority of her biochemistry degree. "You're too smart to believe in fairy tales." I can still hear the way she laughed when I prayed before meals, the distinct sound of intellectual superiority. What started as sisterly teasing had evolved into something that cut much deeper. But here's what neither of us understood. Sometimes the universe forces you to confront your deepest convictions in ways you could never anticipate. For Claire, that reckoning came on December 17th, a night that would challenge everything she thought she knew about reality. A night when the laws of physics, medicine, and probability all seemed to bend for someone who didn't believe in miracles. The division. Claire and I were separated by just 3 years, but sometimes it felt like we came from different generations, different planets even. By the time I was in high school, she was already publishing research papers in college, her name appearing in scientific journals before she could legally drink. Our parents showcased her achievements like trophies, framed certificates lining the hallway, newspaper clippings magnetized to the refrigerator. My art projects and church volunteer awards somehow never made it to those prominent displays. I still remember the Christmas when I was 16. I'd saved up to buy Claire a silver cross necklace. Nothing ostentatious, just a simple pendant I thought was beautiful. When she opened it, the silence in the room was deafening. She held it up like it was contaminated, dangling between her fingers. "Thanks, Em," she said with a forced smile. Very traditional. The necklace disappeared into her drawer, never to be seen again. That night, I heard her and Mom laughing in the kitchen. "What am I supposed to do with a cross?" Claire had asked. "Wear it ironically?" Family dinners became minefields. Dad would mention something from the Sunday sermon, and Claire would launch into a calculated dismantling of religious thinking. Mom would try to change the subject, but Claire was relentless. "I just can't stand intellectual dishonesty," she'd say, looking directly at me. "Especially in this family." But the hardest part wasn't the mockery. It was watching her systematically remove every trace of spirituality from her life, like she was performing surgery on her own past. The children's Bible we'd shared, the bedtime prayers Mom had taught us, even holiday traditions, all excised as cultural mythology unworthy of a scientific mind. I held on to my faith despite it all, finding quiet moments to pray when no one was watching. Sometimes I'd drive 40 minutes to attend a different church, just to avoid Claire's interrogation about the sermon. I built a separate life where my beliefs could breathe, where doubting everything wasn't considered the only path to intelligence. Then came last Thanksgiving. Claire brought her new boyfriend Marcus, another researcher from her lab. They arrived wearing matching t-shirts with scientific equations printed across the front. Clever, ironic. The tension was immediate, but we all pretended not to notice. We made it through appetizers with superficial conversation, careful to avoid any triggering topics, until Dad asked everyone to hold hands for grace. "I think I'll sit this one out," Claire announced, placing her hands deliberately in her lap. Marcus followed suit. Dad's face flushed, but he nodded and continued. As we bowed our heads, I heard Claire whisper something to Marcus, followed by stifled laughter. When I looked up, her eyes were fixed on me with something beyond mockery, pity. After dinner, I found her alone in the kitchen. "Do you have to undermine everything that matters to this family?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What matters is truth, Emma, not comfortable delusions." "You think faith is just delusion? What about love? Can you measure that in your lab?" She laughed, that sharp, dismissive laugh I'd grown to dread. "Love is just neurochemistry. God is just wishful thinking. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you'll actually start living in reality." The words erupted before I could stop them. "I pray for you, Claire, every single night." Her expression hardened. "Well, that's been incredibly effective, hasn't it? Don't waste your time. And definitely don't waste mine with this conversation again." We didn't speak for 3 months after that. No calls, no texts, a complete severing. I'd reach for my phone 100 times to bridge the gap, but always stopped myself. What was there left to say? We'd reached the end of dialogue, the point where fundamental differences render communication impossible. What I didn't know then was that sometimes the universe creates its own conversations when human words fail. And for Claire, that divine intervention would come in the most terrifying form imaginable. The incident. February 23rd, the coldest night of the year. The kind of cold that turns breath into clouds and makes car engines protest with labored growls. I remember because I was wrapping birthday presents for Mom when my phone rang at 11:42 p.m. Dad's name on the screen. My stomach dropped immediately. He never called this late. "Emma." His voice cracked. "It's Claire." According to the police report, Claire had been driving back from a conference in Vermont. A shortcut through county roads to avoid highway traffic. No streetlights, no guardrails, just endless stretches of forest and the occasional frozen lake. The kind of route GPS suggests, but locals avoid, especially in winter. Lake Wyndham sits at the bottom of a sharp curve, its shore barely visible from the road even in daylight. That night, with temperatures at -15, the lake had frozen over completely. But February ice is deceptive, thick at the edges, dangerously thin toward the center. Claire's Subaru left the road at approximately 10:37 p.m. The investigators believe she swerved to avoid a deer, though we'll never know for certain. Her car skidded across 60 feet of snow before hitting the ice at nearly 40 miles per hour. The impact would have been jarring but not catastrophic, if the ice had held. It didn't. The police reconstruction was clinical, detached. Vehicle broke through approximately 30 feet from shore. Water temperature estimated at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Vehicle sank to depth of 22 feet. Complete submersion occurred within 90 seconds. What the report couldn't capture was what Claire experienced in those moments. The sudden cracking sound beneath her tires. The horrifying realization as water began pouring through door seams. The primal panic as her car tilted forward, nose down into black water. The desperate fumbling with her seatbelt as the electrical system shorted out, plunging her into darkness. No one should have known she was there. No passing car witnessed the accident. Her phone had no signal. She'd complained about that stretch of road before. The closest house was over 3 miles away. By all rational calculation, Claire should have become a missing person case, her car discovered days later by chance. But at 10:52 p.m., 15 minutes after her car broke through the ice, the county emergency dispatch received a 911 call. I've listened to that call multiple times. The recording is mostly static and garbled words, but one thing is unmistakable. It came from Claire's phone, the same phone that had no service. The same phone that should have been submerged in water, rendered useless. Yet somehow it connected to emergency services with a precise GPS location. Car, water, help. The dispatcher could barely make out the words, but it was enough to send rescue teams to the exact coordinates. When they arrived 20 minutes later, they found something that defied explanation. Claire's car was indeed at the bottom of the lake, visible through the broken ice. But Claire herself was lying on the shore, soaking wet, unconscious but alive. Nearly 40 feet from where her car had entered the water. The physical impossibility of this cannot be overstated. To escape a sinking vehicle requires exceptional presence of mind, waiting for pressure to equalize, finding a window to break or door to open, fighting disorientation in frigid darkness, then swimming upward, finding the break in the ice, pulling yourself out onto a slippery surface, and somehow crawling 40 feet to shore, all while hypothermia rapidly sets in, shutting down muscular function and cognitive ability. Even an Olympic swimmer with survival training would struggle with these conditions. Claire was neither. She hated swimming. She'd never taken a survival course. By every metric of human capability, What happened that night wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. Yet somehow, the sister who had built her entire identity on dismissing the inexplicable had just become living proof of it. The medics found her with a core body temperature of 93 degrees, hypothermic, but nowhere near the fatal 82-85 degrees they expected after prolonged exposure. Her clothes were frozen stiff, crackling as they lifted her onto the stretcher. But her skin, while cold, wasn't showing signs of frostbite. Most puzzling of all, her breathing was steady and unlabored, despite lungs that should have been compromised by water inhalation. "It doesn't make any sense," the lead paramedic told my father at the hospital. "By every medical standard, she should be dead. I've worked lake accidents for 15 years. Nobody survives this. Not like this." As they loaded her into the ambulance, one of the younger EMTs noticed something else. Claire's right hand was tightly closed, as if holding something. When they gently pried her fingers open, they found nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. But her palm showed a distinct pressure mark, a small cross-shaped indentation pressed deep into her skin, the same shape as the necklace I'd given her years ago, the necklace she'd discarded and never worn. I arrived at the hospital at 2:17 a.m., just as Claire was being moved from emergency to intensive care. I caught a glimpse of her through the door, pale still, connected to machines measuring vital signs that, by all rational understanding, should have flatlined hours earlier. What I didn't know then was that her impossible survival was just the beginning of the inexplicable. The real revelation would come when she finally opened her eyes. The inexplicable. The hospital waiting room became our home for the next 72 hours. Dad paced the worn linoleum floor. Mom clutched her coffee cup like a lifeline, and I sat perfectly still, praying with an intensity I'd never felt before. The doctors moved in and out, their expressions a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. Dr. Levine, the lead physician, had the distinguished look of someone who'd seen everything in 30 years of emergency medicine. But even he seemed disturbed by Claire's case. I intercepted him in the hallway after his third examination. "I don't understand," he admitted, lowering his voice. "Her lungs show evidence of complete submersion. There's water in her respiratory system, but somehow there's no pulmonary edema, no signs of drowning." He showed me the chest x-rays, pointing to cloudy areas in her lungs. "This is lake water. She definitely inhaled it, but it's not causing the damage it should. It's as if her body simply accommodated it." Then came the neurological assessment. After submersion in near-freezing water, brain damage was all but certain. Oxygen deprivation for even 4 minutes causes irreversible harm. Based on the timeline, Claire had been underwater for at least 6 minutes, possibly longer. "We did an MRI to assess the damage," Dr. Levine explained, pulling up the scan on his tablet. He stared at it for a long moment. "There isn't any. No ischemic regions, no hypoxic injury. Her brain looks perfectly normal." The third inexplicable phenomenon came from Claire's blood work. Submersion in cold water triggers a cascade of physiological responses. Stress hormones flood the system, electrolytes become dangerously imbalanced, and cellular breakdown products appear as tissues begin to die. Claire's blood showed none of these markers. Instead, her results indicated what Dr. Levine called a state of preserved homeostasis, as if her body had somehow been protected from the very experience it had undeniably endured. "In 30 years of practice," he told us in the conference room on the second day, "I've never seen anything like this. I've consulted with colleagues at Mayo Clinic and Johns Hopkins. No one has an explanation. Medically speaking, this is impossible." My father, always practical, asked, "But she'll recover?" Dr. Levine hesitated. "All indicators suggest she should make a full recovery. But I want to be clear. This defies everything we know about drowning, hypothermia, and traumatic accidents. I'm not a religious man, Mr. Patterson, but if you are, well, I wouldn't discourage those prayers." The rescue team's report added another layer to the mystery. James Holbrook, the dive specialist who recovered Claire's car, came to the hospital himself, clipboard in hand, but with questions rather than answers. "The driver's side window was intact," he explained, his weathered face tense with concentration. The doors were locked. The seatbelt was still fastened. We had to cut it to remove it from the seat. My mother interrupted. Then how did she— Exactly. Holbrook nodded. There was no exit point. None that we could identify. The sunroof was closed and electronically disabled once the car lost power. The passenger windows were intact. It's as if— He struggled for words. As if she passed through solid matter. He pulled out his phone, showing us underwater footage of the recovery. The car sat upright on the lake bed, all points of entry sealed. The only damage was to the front end from the initial impact. I've recovered 28 vehicles from water in my career, he said quietly. I've never seen anything like this. Your daughter didn't just survive against odds. She escaped through a means I cannot explain. On the third day, at 4:18 a.m., Claire opened her eyes. I was alone with her, Mom and Dad having finally succumbed to exhaustion in the waiting room. I'd been reading Psalms aloud, something Claire would have mocked mercilessly before, when I noticed her eyelids fluttering. Claire, I whispered, moving closer. Can you hear me? Her eyes focused slowly, finding mine. There was something different in them, a depth I'd never seen before, as if she was looking from a great distance. She didn't speak immediately. She just stared, tears beginning to stream down her face. When she finally did speak, her first words sent ice through my veins. They were singing, Emma. Her voice was hoarse but clear. Under the water. They were singing. Before I could ask what she meant, her eyes drifted to the ceiling corner, widening slightly. A faint smile crossed her lips as she whispered, I know you're there. The room was empty except for us. Dr. Sampson, the staff psychiatrist, initially attributed these statements to traumatic delirium, a common response to near-death experiences, he assured us. The brain creates comforting hallucinations to protect itself from the horror of its own mortality. But Claire wasn't having it. As her physical strength returned with astonishing speed, her insistence grew stronger. She was clear, articulate, and completely certain of what she'd experienced. I wasn't alone in the water, she told Dr. Sampson during their recorded session, footage she later shared with me. There were presences, not human, not physical, but undeniably real. They surrounded the car. They guided me. Dr. Sampson nodded professionally. Many drowning survivors report similar sensations. The brain— No, Claire interrupted, with the same sharp tone she'd used to dismantle arguments at family dinners. This wasn't my brain creating comfort. This was external. These beings communicated with me. They sang. I don't know how else to describe it. Vibrations that formed patterns. Patterns that conveyed meaning. And what meaning was that? Dr. Sampson asked. Claire's response was captured in perfect clarity on the video. That everything I thought I knew about reality was dramatically, embarrassingly incomplete. After 5 days of tests that yielded more questions than answers, Claire was released from the hospital. The medical report's conclusion remains one of the most unusual documents in Northeast Medical Center's history. Patient survival defies current scientific understanding. Recovery rate exceeds all established precedents for similar trauma cases. Recommend continued observation and documentation of this medical anomaly. But the true anomaly wasn't just in Claire's body. It was in her mind, in her eyes, in the fundamental way she now moved through the world. Something had changed in my sister, something so profound that even she, with all her scientific vocabulary and analytical skills, struggled to articulate it. The Claire who left that hospital was not the same Claire who had plunged into Lake Wyndham. The sister who had mocked my faith for years was now grappling with an experience that her carefully constructed worldview couldn't contain. And what happened next would shake both of us to our core. The transformation. Claire came to stay with me after her discharge. Her apartment near the research center was a 4th-floor walk-up, impossible with her still healing body. At least, that was the reason we gave each other. The truth hung unspoken between us. Neither of us wanted to be alone with what had happened. From the moment she crossed my threshold, I knew my sister had been fundamentally altered. It wasn't just the physical changes, though those were striking enough. The unusual luminosity of her skin, the steadiness in hands that used to fidget constantly, the deepened timbre of her voice. It was something in her manner, a profound stillness that had replaced her frenetic energy. Claire had always moved through life like someone being chased, filling every moment with productive activity. Now she could sit for hours by my living room window, watching snowfall with an expression of someone witnessing it for the first time. She'd trace patterns on the glass with her fingertip, sometimes smiling at nothing I could see. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked on the third day, when I found her standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at the reflection in the microwave door. "I'm not sure okay is the right word," she answered without turning. "I'm recalibrating." The sister who once filled every silence with analysis or argument now spoke rarely, and when she did, her words carried a careful weight. She who had built her identity on having answers now seemed comfortable with mystery. The change was so dramatic that I found myself missing her argumentative nature, the predictable patterns of our lifelong dynamic. Most unsettling were the moments when she would stop mid-sentence, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something beyond my perception. Her eyes would track movement in empty corners of rooms. Once, while I was preparing dinner, I heard her having what sounded like a one-sided conversation in the guest room. When I asked who she was talking to, she simply said, "Old friends." She refused to discuss the accident directly. When I attempted to ask about what happened underwater, she would gently redirect the conversation or simply leave the room. The only person she spoke to about it was Marcus, her boyfriend, who visited once and never returned. I overheard fragments of their conversation, Claire trying to explain something, Marcus responding with increasing agitation. "You need to see someone, Claire. A real psychiatrist, not the hospital staff. You think I'm having a psychotic break? That would be the convenient explanation, wouldn't it? I think trauma does things to people, changes their thinking." "You're right about that part," she had replied with unsettling calmness. "But not in the way you imagine." After he left, Claire sat on my couch, remarkably composed for someone whose relationship had just imploded. "He needs the world to make sense within his parameters," she said. "I can't blame him for that. I was the same way before." Her research colleagues were equally disturbed by the new Claire. 2 weeks after the accident, she informed her department head that she would not be returning to the quantum physics study she'd spent 3 years developing. When he asked why, she reportedly said, "Because I'm pursuing a more direct investigation of the same phenomena." What struck me most was how Claire's reflexive hostility toward faith had vanished. The sister who used to roll her eyes when I mentioned prayer now watched me with curious attention during my morning devotions. She borrowed books from my shelf, not just the Bible, but works on comparative religion, mystical experiences, and consciousness studies. One night, about 3 weeks after she'd moved in, I woke to the sound of glass breaking. I rushed to the guest room to find Claire sitting on the floor, surrounded by shattered pieces of a water glass, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she made no move to clean up the mess. I was trying to hold it, and then I wasn't. I was back there. I sat beside her, careful of the glass. "In the lake?" She nodded, drawing a shaky breath. "It keeps happening. Not just in dreams now, flashes during the day. But it's not traumatic. That's what no one understands. What happened to me wasn't just about surviving. It was about seeing." "Seeing what?" I asked, my heart pounding. Claire looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since the accident. "Everything, Emma. The membrane between worlds is so much thinner than we think. Reality is porous." She told me then, in halting sentences, what had happened after her car broke through the ice. How the initial panic had given way to a strange calm as water filled the vehicle. How the darkness had gradually become illuminated by what she described as ribbons of light, moving with purpose and intelligence. "They surrounded the car," she said, her voice steadying. "They moved through solid matter, through metal and glass, as if it wasn't there. And then they were inside with me, all around me." Claire described how these presences had communicated without words, conveying complex ideas through what she could only call frequencies of meaning. How they had shown her glimpses of a reality existing alongside our own, interpenetrating our world, but usually beyond our perception. "They took me out of the car," she said. "Not by breaking windows or opening doors. They simply adjusted the relationship between my physical form and the material world, like changing the frequency of a radio to pick up a different station." She described being guided through the water, without swimming, without even the sensation of being wet. It wasn't that I didn't need oxygen. It was that I was breathing something else. When I asked who or what these beings were, Claire fell silent for a long moment. "I asked them the same question," she finally said. "They showed me. It's hard to explain. They exist in the spaces between what we consider solid reality. They've always been there. Some of them have been trying to communicate with humans for millennia. We've given them different names in different cultures." "Angels?" I whispered. Claire didn't dismiss the word as I expected. "That's one interpretation, but it's like trying to describe quantum mechanics using Bronze Age vocabulary. The words don't exist for what they actually are." The most profound change became evident in the 3rd month after the accident. Claire began experiencing what she called continuations, ongoing communications from the entities she'd encountered underwater. These weren't dramatic visions but subtle impressions. Symbols appearing in ordinary objects, patterns in nature suddenly revealing deeper meanings, moments when ordinary sounds aligned into what she described as messages. Most striking were the 3 persistent phenomena that couldn't be easily dismissed as psychological. First, electronic devices behaved erratically around her. Lights flickering when she entered rooms, cell phones ringing with no caller, computers displaying code she hadn't typed. The IT specialist at my office witnessed this firsthand when Claire visited me at work, leaving him visibly shaken. Second, she developed an uncanny prescience about certain events. She would know who was calling before the phone rang. She anticipated a major snowstorm 3 days before meteorologists detected it. Most dramatically, she insisted we visit our parents the exact weekend our father experienced a minor heart event. Mild enough that he recovered fully, but serious enough that immediate medical attention made a critical difference. The third phenomenon was the hardest to rationalize. Multiple people, strangers with no connection to each other, reported seeing a soft blue light surrounding Claire in photographs. My neighbor's 13-year-old daughter captured it most clearly during an impromptu portrait session. When questioned separately, 3 different people used identical language to describe the effect, calling it a thin blue outline, like a second skin. Through all of this, Claire's scientific mind remained active, though redirected. She began filling notebooks with equations and diagrams, creating what looked like a mathematical framework for experiences traditionally considered spiritual. When I asked what she was working on, she simply said, "Translation." The sister who once needed material proof for everything now moved confidently through a world where the immaterial was just as real, just as consequential. The woman who had mocked my faith now spoke of dimensions beyond physical perception with the authority of someone who had walked there. 4 months after the accident, sitting in my kitchen as dawn broke over the trees, Claire finally articulated what had been transforming inside her all along. "The greatest arrogance," she said quietly, "is believing that what we can detect with our limited senses constitutes the entirety of reality." I was so certain, Emma. So smugly, foolishly certain. She reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture so uncharacteristic of the old Claire that it brought tears to my eyes. "I owe you an apology," she said, "the deepest kind." And in that moment, I understood that the lake hadn't just given my sister back her life. It had given her something far more precious, the humility to recognize how much she didn't know, the reconciliation. Spring came slowly that year, as if nature itself was giving Claire time to heal completely before demanding the renewal of seasons. By early April, the last patches of snow had melted, and something else was thawing too, the frozen distance that had defined our relationship for so long. We began with small moments: coffee on my porch swing, walking through the park as crocuses pushed through the soil, cooking dinner together in comfortable silence. The absence of conflict was so unfamiliar that it felt almost disorienting, like stepping off a treadmill after hours of running. "I keep waiting," I admitted one evening, "for you to tell me that you've found a scientific explanation for everything that happened." that it was all oxygen deprivation, or some rare neurological response. Claire looked up from the book she was reading. Ironically, a text on quantum mysticism that the old Claire would have dismissed as pseudoscience. "That would be comforting, wouldn't it?" she replied. "For both of us, in different ways." "What do you mean?" She closed the book, keeping her finger between the pages. "For me, it would restore my old worldview. The clean, orderly universe where everything follows understandable rules. For you," she hesitated, "it would validate your position in our old arguments. Prove you were right all along about the limitations of science." Her insight startled me. I hadn't realized how much I'd been seeking that validation. How ready I was to say "I told you so" after years of being intellectually dismissed. "But that's not what's happening here," Claire continued. "What I experienced wasn't the triumph of spirituality over science. It was the revelation that they're asking different questions about the same reality. That conversation opened the door to what I now consider the most profound period of my life. 2 months of dialogue with my sister that transformed us both. We would talk until dawn sometimes, excavating years of misunderstanding, examining our inherited beliefs, and slowly building a new foundation for our relationship." Claire spoke about her experience with increasing clarity, no longer hesitant to revisit the details. "There was a moment underwater," she told me, "when everything I believed about consciousness was shattered. I understood that awareness isn't produced by the brain, it's received by it, like a television receives signals. When the beings adjusted my relationship to physical reality, they didn't just save my body, they changed my reception. What moved me most deeply was how Claire approached her past mockery of my faith. There was no dramatic moment of conversion, no theatrical declaration of belief. Instead, there was something more authentic: humility. "The most dangerous 4 words in science," she said one night, "are, 'We already know that.' I applied them to your spiritual life without ever truly investigating it. I dismissed your experiences because they didn't fit my model of reality. You were doing what you thought was right," I offered, "protecting me from delusion." "No," she said firmly. "I was protecting myself from uncertainty. Your faith threatened me because it acknowledged mystery. I needed a world without gaps in human knowledge." The evening Claire asked for my forgiveness remains etched in my memory with perfect clarity. We were sitting on the back steps of our parents' house during a weekend visit, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. Mom and Dad had gone to bed early, leaving us alone with the chorus of spring peepers from the nearby pond. "I've been trying to find the right words," Claire said, her voice barely audible above the frogs, "for what I need to say to you." I waited, watching her profile in the fading light. The old Claire would have filled any silence immediately. This new Claire had learned the power of pauses. "I wounded you," she finally continued, "repeatedly, deliberately, and with the full force of my intellect. I didn't just disagree with your faith. I belittled it. I made you feel childish for believing in something beyond material evidence. I used our family gatherings as stages for my own intellectual performance at your expense." Her voice caught, and I realized she was crying. Something I'd seen perhaps 3 times in our entire adult life. "The worst part," she whispered, "is that I did it from a place of complete ignorance. I had never experienced what you had. I had never even tried. I dismissed the most important dimension of your life without a moment of genuine inquiry." She turned to face me fully, tears now visible on her cheeks. "Can you forgive me for that, Emma? Not because I deserve it, but because I need to ask." The question hung between us, weighted with years of accumulated hurt. In that moment, I felt the full measure of my own resentment. How deeply her ridicule had cut, how thoroughly it had undermined my confidence. The temptation to make her work harder for absolution was surprisingly strong. Instead, I found myself reaching for her hand. "I forgave you a long time ago, Claire. I had to, or the bitterness would have consumed me. But hearing you ask, it heals something I didn't realize was still broken." We sat in silence for a long while after that, hands clasped between us. The forgiveness I'd extended theoretically for years became real in that moment. A living force rather than an abstract principle. Our relationship transformed in the months that followed, not into some perfect harmony without discord, but into something more valuable: authentic connection built on mutual respect. We still disagreed on many things. Claire never adopted traditional religious language or practices. I still found some of her scientific explanations overly complex, but the weaponized contempt that had characterized our interactions was gone, replaced by genuine curiosity about each other's perspectives. Most surprising was how Claire began to defend my beliefs to others. At a department dinner at the university where she had taken a new research position, I overheard her conversation with a colleague who had made a dismissive comment about religious thought. "That's an embarrassingly reductive view, Michael," Claire said, her tone measured but firm. "Spiritual traditions represent thousands of years of human inquiry into consciousness and meaning. Dismissing them because they use different methodologies than laboratory science isn't intellectual rigor. It's intellectual provincialism." When the colleague pressed his point, Claire's response left him speechless. "I used to share your certainty. Then I drowned and discovered how pathetically inadequate our conceptual frameworks are for describing reality. Perhaps you should consider the possibility that the universe is vastly more interesting than your current models suggest." Later that night, I asked her why she had spoken up when she still didn't share my specific beliefs. "Because certainty is the enemy of discovery," she replied simply. "And because anyone who mocks my sister has fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conversation." The most profound transformation wasn't in Claire's new openness to spiritual dimensions, or even in our healed relationship. It was in how we both learned to hold our beliefs with open hands rather than clenched fists. Claire's experience hadn't given her all the answers. It had taught her to ask better questions. And in that space of questioning, we found each other again. 2 years have passed since the night Claire's car broke through the ice at Lake Wyndham. The physical evidence of her ordeal has long since faded. The slight tremor in her right hand gone. The occasional nightmares subsided. The medical follow-ups concluded with notes of continued bewilderment. What remains is harder to document, but impossible to deny. A profound shift in how my sister moves through the world, and by extension, how I understand my own faith journey. Claire never returned to her old research position. Instead, she created an interdisciplinary program at the university studying the intersection of quantum physics, consciousness, and what she carefully terms non-local awareness phenomena. Her former colleagues initially dismissed this as a trauma-induced career suicide. Now they quietly attend her lectures, taking notes with furrowed brows as she presents data that doesn't fit neatly into conventional frameworks. She still doesn't use the language of religion. You won't hear her talk about God or prayer or salvation. But something remarkable happens when she speaks about the intelligent organizing principles she encountered underwater. People of diverse faith backgrounds recognize elements of their own traditions in her descriptions, while those without religious frameworks find accessible entry points to consider dimensions beyond material reality. "The most destructive false choice we've created," she told an audience recently, "is between scientific understanding and spiritual awareness." As if the study of how reality functions somehow precludes the possibility of meaning and purpose within that functioning. The question Claire now poses to skeptics isn't whether they believe in something beyond physical reality. It's whether they're willing to hold their disbelief with the same tentativeness that genuine science requires of belief. "Dogmatic skepticism is just another religion," she said during a panel discussion that went viral online. "True skepticism includes skepticism about the completeness of our current understanding. It demands we remain open to evidence that challenges our most comfortable assumptions." Our family dynamics have shifted too. Sunday dinners no longer devolve into philosophical battlegrounds. Instead, there's a new quality to our conversations, a willingness to explore ideas rather than defend positions. Dad still says grace before meals, and Claire still doesn't pray aloud, but she bows her head in respectful silence, her hand often finding mine under the table in a gesture that needs no explanation. Last December, on the anniversary of the accident, Claire asked me to drive her to Lake Wyndham. I was hesitant, worried about triggering traumatic memories, but she insisted with the quiet certainty that now characterizes her most important decisions. We stood at the shore as the winter sun cast long shadows across the ice. The spot where her car had broken through had been marked with a small warning sign, though few would connect it to the miraculous survival that happened there. "I've never told you what they said to me at the end," Claire said, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Right before they brought me back to shore." I waited, watching her face as she gazed across the frozen expanse. "They showed me that what we call consciousness isn't confined to our bodies or even to our lifetimes. That what you and I experience as separate awareness is actually part of a continuous field, like different waves on the same ocean." She smiled faintly. Not exactly a revolutionary concept in spiritual traditions, practically a cliché. But experiencing it directly, she turned to me, her eyes reflecting the winter light. "They also showed me something about you, Emma. About the prayers you've been saying for me since we were children." My throat tightened. "What about them? They create patterns. Actual, visible patterns in what you might call the subtle structure of reality. I saw them. Thousands of them. Stretching back years. Like golden threads running between us. Even during the times I was cruelest to you, those threads never broke." I couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the image and its implications. "I don't know if what saved me that night was what you'd call God," Claire continued. "I don't know if the beings were angels or something else entirely, but I know this with absolute certainty. Your love, expressed through those prayers, created something real, something that existed independent of whether I believed in it or not." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. When she opened it, I recognized the silver cross necklace I'd given her all those years ago, the one she'd mocked and discarded. "I found this in my old dresser after the accident," she said, lifting it carefully. "I don't wear it the way you might, as a symbol of faith, but I carry it as a reminder of something I now know to be true, that love persists beyond rejection, that connection transcends understanding, and that some of the most real things in this universe are the things we can't measure. I tell this story not to convince you that my faith tradition is the right one, or that Claire's experience proves any particular theology. The mystery at the heart of what happened that winter night remains precisely that, a mystery. Claire continues to investigate it through her research, and I continue to understand it through my faith. We've learned that these are complementary approaches to truth, not competing ones. What I can tell you with certainty is this. My sister made fun of me for believing in God until she drowned in a frozen lake and encountered something that transformed her understanding of reality. Whether you call that something God, consciousness, intelligent energy, or something else entirely, depends on the conceptual framework you bring to the question. But the transformation itself, that part is undeniable. I've watched it unfold day by day in the person who knows me best in the world. If you've ever had your deepest beliefs dismissed or ridiculed by someone you love, I hope our story offers some measure of peace. Not because it proves you're right, neither Claire nor I would claim such certainty anymore, but because it demonstrates something more important, that even the most entrenched skeptic can have their world broken open by experiences that transcend their current understanding. And if you're the skeptic in someone else's life, consider the possibility that your certainty, however well-founded it seems, might be premature. That the universe might contain dimensions of reality your current instruments cannot detect. That your loved one's faith, however irrational it appears to you, might be responding to something real. Claire and I often end our public conversations with a question that has become something of a signature. What would change in your life if you held your deepest convictions with open hands instead of clenched fists? We've found that when people truly engage with this question, whether they approach life through science, faith, or some combination of the two, something remarkable happens. The arguments that once divided them begin to lose their sharp edges. The need to be right gradually yields to the desire to understand. And in that space of humility, real connection becomes possible.